Hello and welcome to the webinar today. Our webinar is called What is a Literature Review in the Age of AI? Presented by Gary Thomas, author of many well-renowned research method titles. My name is Fawzia Eastwood and I'm a marketing manager at Sage for the Research Methods books portfolio. I'm a cisgender woman of South Asian background. I have long dark brown hair, brown eyes and olive skin, and I'm wearing a green jumper. My pronouns are she/her. Before we start the webinar, I'd like to share some webinar housekeeping information. We're recording the webinar. However, we've switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presenter and hosts. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without background noise. The chat box won't be available for participants during this webinar, but if you do have any questions, please write them in the question and answer box, and we'll reply to as many of those as we can during the session, with some answered live by the presenters, and then try to follow up with any that we didn't get round to answering today. Please take advantage of our presenters' expertise and focus any questions you may have around the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, we are recording the webinar, and we'll upload the recorded video on Sage's YouTube channel over the coming weeks. We'll also share it via email and on our social media channels. Sage is on X and also on Blue Sky, so do follow us there if you aren't already. It's at sagepub.com. We've made closed captions available during this webinar, so do switch those on if they're helpful for you. Today's webinar is hosted by Sage. Sage is a global academic publisher of books, journals, and library resources with a growing range of technologies to enable discovery, access, and engagement. Our mission is building bridges to knowledge, supporting the development of ideas through the research process to scholarship that is certified, taught, and applied across all fields of social science. With 60 years of publishing experience, our robust list of publications and digital resources has grown with the social sciences and continues to hold qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research to rigorous standards. Sage Content is here to help you at every stage of your research journey, with textbooks laying out the fundamentals of research process, journals highlighting the latest innovations, the Sage Research Methods platform that combines a library of content with interactive tools to guide research at all levels, and the online community method space. We're delighted to introduce today's webinar, which is on the theme of AI and literature reviews, presented by author Gary Thomas. His Sage textbook is called How to Do Your Literature Review, and you can see that on the next slide, which published recently, and it will be referenced during this webinar. If you see the next slide, you can find out more about the book at our website, www.sagepub.co.uk, or if you scan the QR code, you can also find the information there. If you're attending today's webinar, you can get a 25% discount using the code SAGEAUTH25, or if you're a lecturer, you can request an electronic inspection copy online. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our presenter, Gary Thomas. Gary Thomas is an Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Birmingham. His teaching and research are focused on inclusion, special education, and research methodology in education, with a particular focus on case study. He has conducted research funded by the AHRC, the ESRC, the Newfield Foundation, the Leverhulme Trust, the Department for Education, Barnardo's, local authorities, and a range of other organisations. He has co-edited the British Educational Research Journal and is currently an executive editor of Educational Review. He is the author of many books, including the how-to books for Sage and books for Oxford University Press. Delighted to have you here, Gary. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Fawzia. Thanks for a very nice introduction. Not much to add, really, to what Fawzia said. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Education in the College of Social Sciences at the University of Birmingham. In terms of what I look like, I'm an old, white, bald guy. I don't think there's much else to say. So without further ado, I'll proceed to the webinar. This is an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. First of all, I want to look at what a literature review is. I want to look at mind mapping, using AI, the advantages and disadvantages of using AI, and scaffolds for structuring a literature review in ways that AI could never manage. And that's something particularly that I want to focus on, because I think AI does have serious limitations in terms of writing an interesting, targeted, well-constructed literature review. I think the literature review written, or at least the synthesis written by AI, can be quite one-dimensional. So I've taken this from my book as to what a literature review is. The literature review has to synthesize, it has to integrate, has to identify themes, pinpoint gaps, perhaps discover and discuss methods of research being used in the area. And then it has to critically reflect on those and on the nature and the quality of them. And it has to draw conclusions and comment on the validity of those conclusions. And can AI do any of this? Well, I think it can certainly search brilliantly, but so can many databases such as PubMed. It can integrate and synthesize up to a point, but the synthesis is often quite limited and focuses on particular easy to identify criteria in the literature. Some AI, like ChatGPT, is good for sort of brainstorming around themes and even on lines of agreement among authors. Other machines are useful for, and we'll look at those later in the webinar. Not so good at things like pinpointing gaps, identifying disagreements, discussing methods of research being used. It will identify the methods of research, but can it say whether those are the right methods of research? Probably not. And it can't really critically reflect on the nature and quality or draw conclusions from any of this. So it can do a number of things brilliantly, but it does other things less well. And that's what I'll try and highlight as we go through this PowerPoint. So taking this from my book, I've identified these 5 different processes that are involved in a literature review. You've got scanning, scoping, searching, structuring, and synthesizing. Where is AI useful? Is it useful in the first area in scanning? Probably not. In finding core references and scoping, again, not really. Where it comes into its own is in gathering more information and using databases, adopting and using a number of different databases. It's not good at structuring, and this is something that I'll spend some time on. Not good at structuring a review. I'll talk about different kinds of structure, different sort of scaffolds, as I've called them, to a review: thematic, funneled, chronological. I'll have a look at those as we go through. And not really very good at weaving your findings into a narrative. And I've identified the chapters that are related to each of those elements here. It's probably useful to know that if you can access the book, there's a code given to, or an address given to, the online resources, and there's a PowerPoint for each one of these chapters. So do buy the book and you'll get the code for each of those PowerPoints. So first of those points that I said were an important part of human intelligence, really, rather than machine intelligence, is mind mapping. And I think this helps to give a structure around the review, helps to build a review that's meaningful, that addresses a research question, and is 3-dimensional. So a mind map may be useful in suggesting shape and structure of a review. mind map may highlight general and specific elements of the topic and a funnel for the review, significant controversies, different aspects of the core theme, changes over time. And again, those aren't the kinds of things that a literature review, AI will really identify. It's where human intelligence is necessary. I've taken this as an example from the book. This is an example of a mind map that I've given in the book with a question in the center, a number of different points, number of different ideas coming off from the central question, with possibly key references coming off from those. I think it's important to stress, and something I do stress throughout the book, is that something like a mind map shouldn't be seen really as a straitjacket. It can take a number of any number of forms. The idea is that it helps you, helps the researcher, helps the student to identify themes and to build a structure for the literature review. So using AI, what are the main? I'll just move my picture over here so I can read my PowerPoint. The first one I've highlighted here is elicit.com, which some people may be familiar with. It's the one that I use most often, elicit.com. I think it's probably the most sophisticated one in what it does. And it's quite interactive in the sense that if you log on with elicit.com, they will send you emails updating you with all sorts of new information about the program, keeping you informed. And of course, the developments are going on all the time. They're continually becoming more sophisticated. Semantic Scholar, similar to Google Scholar, but allows you to target finds according to fields of study. Consensus.app is similar to elicit.com. Connected Papers lets you map related articles. We'll have a look at that in a minute because I think it's a particularly interesting one and can help to guide how a review might be constructed. ChatGPT, of course, which people will be familiar with, I think is, right at the beginning of a literature review is helpful in terms of brainstorming research questions. Of course, what we have to avoid throughout in any of these, and particularly with something like ChatGPT, which is generative, generates new content, is what students must be advised strongly against is to use any of that generative content itself directly in their work. And of course, another aspect of AI is that programs like Turnitin are becoming more sophisticated at finding AI generated text. Then Google Scholar, which isn't strictly speaking AI, but with features such as My Library, which enables users to organize finds. So there's a number of different programs. Just to look at, this is a screenshot from a page that came up from elicit.com when I put in a question about trends in private special school spending in the UK. I can't remember whether that's the actual question I put in or whether that's a paraphrase that elicit.com's come up with. But that was the topic, and it's something that I road tested elicit.com on this question because it's something I know quite a lot about. What it did, it gives a report here. It gathered papers. It gathered 50 papers, selected two, which I'm pleased to say one was mine, and it extracted data. And here is the summary that it made. It's an okay summary, I think. It's not particularly sophisticated. It's not the summary I would have made, but well, maybe that's a good thing. But like I say, it's fairly one-dimensional, really, and picks on particular aspects of the two papers that it's identified. So down the bottom here, And again, this is just one screenshot of one of the pages of illicit.com. It's it can do a huge amount. It tells you what the studies are that it's identified, tells you what the study designs were. It tells you about the geographic coverage, about the time period, about the data collection methods, and whether it used a full text. And in that sense, it's telling you a lot about the papers, which you can use in putting together a literature review. Another one that's very interesting, I think, is connected papers. And this draws a diagram of its finds and show how the finds are related to one another. So what I did here, this is an example, again, a screenshot of one of its maps. I put in this article here, an article by Sarah Parsons on autism in the middle here. And what it's done is identify a whole range of different papers, cognately linked on the left here, and another cognate group on the right. So this is on the basis, presumably, something like keywords. And the nearer to the original article the papers are, the closer the relationship. And as you'd expect, given that the first paper was by Sarah Parsons, the closest ones are also by Sarah Parsons. I think it's really interesting tool, connected papers, because again, like I was saying about Google Scholar and its My Library facility, it encourages particularly students to actually think about what they're finding and think about how articles may be linked. And, it kind of imposes the however and the nevertheless and consequently into a write-up. Right, Google Scholar, which everybody will be familiar with, but I thought it was worth including it because somebody actually in the questions asked about the difference between assistive AI and generative AI. And I suppose you would call, I mean, it is a blurred line, as the questioner said, but I suppose you would call Google Scholar assistive AI, although, strictly speaking, it isn't AI. Searches masses of databases and articles, identifies a whole range which are most closely related to a search query. I think, as I've said, it's particularly interesting because it has this facility, My Library, which I spend some time talking about in the book, which encourages you to think about the finds that you're making and encourages you to sort them in particular ways. And of course, other, reference managers such as Zotero or RefWorks enable you to do that. But I think Google Scholar, the familiarity is an important aspect of it, it's worth recommending to students, that My Library facility. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using AI? Positives and negatives. Positives to AI. Well, they're good at finding relevant papers and those that may be tucked away in a remote corner of the literature somewhere. I suppose we've all had all experienced the phenomenon of thinking that we know a topic inside out and back to front, and then completely randomly and by serendipity, you come across an article which is spot on relevant to your topic of interest that wasn't identified by anything at all and you didn't know anything about. And it's good at finding that kind of thing. The converse of that, of course, is that it may miss some obvious finds. And certainly that's been my experience where I put in one of my articles where I know that there are related articles to it, and it's for some reason missed them. They're great for snowballing backwards and forwards. Of course, you can do that on Google Scholar, but AI tools will do that automatically for you. They review a range of databases such as PubMed, ERIC, PsycInfo, saving you the trouble of going to each individually. Negatives to AI. They may latch onto a word in a search query or title that isn't centrally relevant, go over the top in offering finds based on that word. So, they latch onto a particular keyword and just go OTT on that word. They're not good at telling a story, even when they seem to be offering some kind of digest. In fact, that's more like a list in my experience, albeit a list that's made to look like prose than a narrative. And of course, that's what I've often said about literature reviews is that, and particularly a mistake that students make, is to make the literature review merely a list, not a list that addresses something in any way, but a list of kind of vaguely relevant finds. And relying on them too closely can mean that the form, structure, and priorities of the existing literature can be privileged over a thoughtful review of what's important for the issue that you're exploring. And I think that's probably a criticism of any literature review, really, not just literature review done by AI, but any literature review can, and particularly if we're thinking about the so-called systematic literature reviews, which so closely define and are so closely targeted on particular words, what you tend to find is what I've called an introverted thought bubble. You get people finding people who reference them. You get, and again, this is a problem about literature review generally, that however you organize it, you tend to find what you expect to find. And I think AI sort of exaggerates that problem, really. It emphasizes the form, structure, and priorities of existing literature. More negatives, they may miss some obvious finds and connections. That's been my experience anyway. They can't understand how sources fit or don't fit together. They will see points of connection, but can't sort of go that one step up like human intelligence does and say, well, this person's agreeing with that person's disagreeing with this person. I wonder why this is. And they can't offer lines of reasoning that help to answer a research question. And this is where the scaffolds that I'm going to talk about really come into their own. So the fifth point that I want to make is about scaffolds for structuring a literature review in ways that AI could never manage. What I suggested in the book is that there are these 5 different basic structures to a literature review. Not that you always find these structures, but in my experience and having looked at some hundreds of literature reviews, I think one can say that they do, at their best, follow one of these styles. I think the worst literature reviews tend to be more list-like and tend not to be answering some question meaningfully. So funneled, thematic, chronological, comparison-based, and mixed. And I'll look at each of those. So the first of those, funneled. So funneling a literature review, that kind of scaffold around a literature review, involves moving from the broad to the narrow, the general to the specific, You start with wider, more contextual aspects of your topic and gradually sharpen your focus until you reach the particular aspect of the topic that you're interested in. So you start off with work that's generally relevant, the big picture, move on to stuff that's nearer to your research, and then closely related work. And something I suppose I should have said, and I emphasize throughout the book, is that of course there are two kinds of literature review, really. Well, I mean, it depends how you categorize them. I mean, there's systematic and narrative reviews, but what I'm thinking about here is the review that is which is part of a bigger empirical piece of work, or a review that is freestanding, that it's on its own. So it's just a literature review without any empirical work. And if we're thinking in that way about, those different kinds of review, the more complex reviews are going to need to take some sort of structure of this kind. It's going to be more difficult in a literature review, which is part of a broader piece of empirical work, depending on the nature of the work. With an undergraduate dissertation, for example, there's not really going to be very much space to organize a scaffold such as this, but it can give a general picture about the shape of a review. So the example I've given in the book of the funneled review is of treatment for heart disease as a topic. And you might start off, for example, with discussion about prevalence, discussion about major developments in treatment, how things have moved forward in big steps. You might move on to education and awareness as elements of treatment, and then move on specifically to forms of treatment. So moving from the general to the specific. So the next one is thematic. You might organize your review around the themes that you discover as you progress through your search, especially useful where there's no clear linear structure to the relationship between sub-areas of work in your topic of interest, or where a broad topic branches off straightforwardly into several themes. So, got your main topic and branches off into various different themes. Example I've given is of a topic such as democracy and the media landscape, which may split into themes such as reduced journalistic autonomy, reduced diversity of views, oligopoly stifling the growth of new organizations. And I've been focusing really on the more sophisticated, more targeted forms of AI, such as illicit.com and connected papers. But if you're thinking about how to identify these things, I think ChatGPT can be really useful in terms of stimulating new ideas, with, again, the strong health warning that one mustn't be using the kinds of generative content that it comes up with. But it certainly can be useful in identifying themes such as this, which can then, of course, be taken forward with further searches. Then chronological is another one of the scaffolds, particularly useful if there's clearly a time basis to the topic. May, for example, be interested in how ideas and practice have moved over time. And here, databases and discovery tools provide an easy route to examining change by offering the option to examine material in chronological order. So you might have a topic such as changing perspectives on X. The example I've given in the book is of changing perspectives on sports coaching. And you might find if you were looking at something like that, that there were, if breaking things into time segments, there might have been particular moments at which there was a sort of paradigm shift in the nature of coaching. And I've given this as a particular example in the book. The next scaffold, comparison based. And sometimes there is a noticeable issue about the kind of research that's being done. Some people think that it should be done in this way. Some people think it should be done in that way. Sometimes people don't notice that there are particular leanings in a corpus of research, and aren't able or don't address it in any way. So the thing is that those different perspectives generate conspicuously different kinds of findings and understandings. And if that's the case, it might be a good idea to structure a review around those different perspectives. So different worldviews, ideologies, or methodological positions may lead to very different ideas about the nature of research, and thereafter to practice stemming from that research. So the example I've given in the book, move this over. The example I've given in the book is one I've taken from an American psychologist, Peter Johnston, who did some very interesting work in the 1980s on the research into reading difficulty. And what Johnston found was that nearly all the research which was done into reading difficulty is done in a particular experimental paradigm. And he said, well, that's really not good enough. That particular paradigm is going to make conclusions of a particular kind. It's going to lead to particular kinds of practical solutions being suggested by practitioners. He suggested that outside that methodological position, if research was primarily done via case study, you'd come to very different conclusions about what causes reading difficulty. That the conclusions would be more about anxiety, neurosis, rather than something going wrong in children's brains. And I mean, if there is a divide of that kind, that would make a very interesting basis for a literature review. But again, thinking about AI, is that something that AI is going to be able to comment on? It might actually. It might notice that research is of a particular kind, but of course it won't draw any conclusions about the practical implications, for example. Mixed, I suppose, if we're thinking about a good review tends to be, and I'm talking about narrative reviews rather than systematic reviews here. Don't really have time to go into the difference between narrative and systematic reviews here, but I've devoted a whole chapter to it in the book. But in the best narrative reviews, they will be of a mixed character. So it may be a combination of the scaffolds I've talked about is appropriate. The review may take shape around how research has happened over time, with themes, subjects, issues, controversies being discussed. Review may, for example, start with a historical context, charting the progress of knowledge and understanding in the area, and moving on to a thematic perspective, and proceeding to a discussion of the influence of particular authors in the field. And I've suggested here, if the topics of is one that's well known to you, to the student, or to the researcher, and if you have experience as a practicing professional and have a good grasp of the themes, the dialogue and arguments of the field, it may well be the best choice, because you can contribute your own knowledge and experience to the structure that you give to the review. So what does it look like? Obviously, you've got your topic. You might take a historical perspective at the outset, looking at what's happened in the past and how things are developed. You might look at related themes around the topic. Might look at more general issues to do with the topic and narrow down to specific issues, as in the funnel scaffold. And you might look at disagreements and controversies in the field. You introduce the however, the nevertheless, the but that I think AI, at least at the moment, in my experience, has a lot of difficulty in contributing. So what are the main points that I want to make from what I've been talking about today? AI is brilliant at searching and summarizing, and even up to a point synthesizing, but although the synthesis tends to be a bit flat, it can even comment on the nature of the work that's being done in a field. But what I've tried to point out is that searching and summarizing are only a small part of a literature review, and obviously in the book I tackle what a literature review should in main part be about. It should be about addressing a question and finding the literature that's relevant to that question, integrating it, synthesizing it, commenting on it, drawing conclusions. So the review has to develop a narrative that addresses a research question, highlights strengths, weaknesses, gaps, anomalies, and disagreements in an area, critically reflects on the nature and quality of the literature, and provides a structure that most usefully captures the state of the relevant literature. The point I tried to make is that although AI is very good at some things, it can't yet do most of this. Although, you know, navigating the various different kinds of tool that are available, whether it's assistive or generative AI, you can, you know, draw on them. They are tools, and we should think of them as tools. They can be used as tools which can be used to construct a really first-class, excellent review. Okay, so I think I'll finish there and move on to Amber with the questions and answers.
Hi, thank you very much, Gary, for that very insightful, very engaging discussion on literature reviews and AIs. And as you very correctly said, we are now on to the question and answer section. Amber is going to be co-hosting this section with me. And over to you, Amber. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant, Gary. So thank you so much. Just to introduce myself, I'm Amber Howard. I'm a marketing executive at Sage, working on the research methods lists. I'm a white female with glasses, brown hair, and headphones, and my pronouns are she, her. So to jump right into things, because we've had so many amazing questions in the chat, we'll start off with one that was pre-submitted, which is, how do you decide whether a piece of work is generated by AI or a human brain after reading a student's essay?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Well, I think there are a number of ways, really. You can do it through your human intelligence, or you can do it through AI, AI about AI, because, you know, now there are new AI tools that are being developed that spot AI. But I think when I've read it, although AI often puts things together which sound really nice and really sophisticated, when you look at it in a bit more detail. It's all rather cliched and tends to be a bit derivative and one-dimensional. Perhaps it's better than, the not so good student work, in the sense that it's grammatically correct and it's all in the right order. But it doesn't really get beyond a sort of C grade, I don't think, personally. It just focuses on particular aspects of the work, like sample size, methods used. 70% said this was important, 30% said that was important. Doesn't really go much beyond that. So if you look at a piece of work, you can see, I think, when you go from paragraph 1, which is clearly written by Joe Bloggs, to the second paragraph, which is perfectly grammatically correct, albeit not very interesting. You can tell that difference in style. But having said that, Turnitin's now got its own detection tool that analyzes submissions for signs of AI and AI paraphrasing tools. And there are others, including GPT-0 and Originality AI. And there's lots of useful YouTube videos now on the new the AI that's available about detecting AI, because of course the field's mushrooming all the time, and it's a bit of an arms race, I suppose, in terms of what AI produces and tools to detect AI. But I suppose Turnitin, which people will be familiar with, is the most familiar one, and it's got its own mechanisms for detecting AI.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We've had a live question that sort of ties in with that, so we'll jump to that one, which is, if a student uses, say, elicit.com for their literature review, would Turnitin pick this up as plagiarism? And then I guess as an add-on to that, how should that be avoided when writing a literature review with the assistance of AI?
Well, I guess the thing is to avoid the generative part of it, because, in the example I showed you from elicit.com, it does come up with its own summary. The thing is not to use that, but to say, well, what's this summary saying? Why is it saying it? What does that imply? So, to avoid the generative elements of AI, I think is the key thing.
Brilliant, thank you. Moving on to some more live questions, because we've had so many brilliant ones. The top upvoted one at the moment is, what strategies can you recommend for counteracting biases in what AI will locate? For example, algorithms that perpetuate the visibility of certain kinds of content, publications, etc., at the expense of others, and therefore present a skewed view of a field or topic.
Very interesting. Well, I suppose I don't know where to start really, because it's such a complex field, and you've got issues like the difference between systematic and narrative review. Systematic review uses very specific kinds of criteria to generate a literature review, focusing, for example, on randomized control trials, particularly used in medical and pharmaceutical research. It's trying there. It is deliberately restricting itself, which has been one of the big criticisms of systematic literature review. And clearly AI can exaggerate rather than ameliorate any problems there, because you're telling it specifically only find RCTs. As to biases and algorithms, I'm not sure. I suppose one has to take a kind of fairly conspiratorial line on it if you assume that it is deliberately an AI tool such as elicit.com is deliberately finding stuff of a particular kind. I think that's less likely, to be honest, than the AI finding stuff by mistake, getting hallucinated by particular keywords, or just any word in the title of a key piece of literature that you fed into it. You know, I've certainly had that experience that it just finds stuff that is of a particular area, maybe a particular geographical area in a key reference. And I think that's where you'll get the main biases. But I take the point, you know, that there may be in certain areas, you know, politics maybe, can't think of any others at the moment, but there may be particular biases which are introduced. How you get around that, I don't know. Try using a variety of different AI tools, or go back to something which is less generative, such as Google Scholar, such as the databases. PubMed is brilliant now. It almost operates as, well, I suppose it does operate as AI on its own, because you can just put in a search query just as an ordinary question to PubMed, and it'll come up with answers. So yeah, I think the thing to do is to know what you've got and to use the tools intelligently, human intelligently.
Brilliant. No, that's really useful to know. You mentioned briefly about hallucinations, and I noticed a question pop up in the chat about that, and how you would counteract the hallucinations, and an AI system sort of taking one word and running off with that. And I think you touched briefly on it, but just to sort of go back to that question of how we would prevent that from happening.
Well, if you do find that it does seem to be hallucinated by a particular word, try using different keywords, you know, or try changing around your question so that it's you know, of a different kind, because you may get a completely different set of answers. I mean, when I put in some questions to elicit.com or Connected Papers or whatever in subjects that I know about, I get, you know, the most extraordinary collection of articles being identified, some of which are no relevance whatsoever, you know, and some which are very relevant. So I think the thing to do is to use different sources of different machines, different tools, and to go back to the more assistive technologies such as Google Scholar.
Brilliant, thank you. Moving on to a sort of different topic, we've had a question asking, what are your thoughts about how we can respond to students using AI in literature reviews when completing undergraduate literature review assessments? Should we embrace that this will happen and teach the pros and cons from the start, or should we amend the way we structure assessments to include part use of AI in the assessment guidelines?
Oh gosh, yeah, a bit of both, I think. I think, you know, you're not going to stop students using them, so we have to come to terms with them, and we have to perhaps find different methods of assessment, and to look particularly for the kinds of, to be particularly aware of the kinds of things that if literature review, and I know it is in health studies, literature review, the freestanding literature review, because of the ethical concerns of doing empirical work in undergraduate dissertations, undergraduate nurses, for example, are asked to do literature reviews. The thing to do, I think, is to focus on the kinds of things that I've been focusing on in looking at those scaffolds, to really focus on the structure of a review, to get people talking about the methodology that they've used, because although I've slagged off systematic reviews up to a point in my book, well, not slagged them off, but offered some constructive criticisms of systematic reviews, you know, they've got some very valid points to make about narrative reviews and reviews in the way that they've normally been written. One of the main ones of which is that, you know, those narrative reviews give no idea about how the material has been selected. people need to be much more open and to have a methodology section in a freestanding literature review, to have a methodology section about how you did the literature review. So, what AI tools did you use? What audit processes did you use in changing the review as you went through? Because I think it is terribly important to be able to change the review as you go through, as you find out more and more stuff. You may completely shift direction of the kind of thing that you want to look at. And I think that audit process is particularly important. And that audit process is something that systematic reviewers would frown upon, but of course an undergraduate wouldn't be able to do a systematic review. So I think that methodology section is particularly important, and looking at the various different structures which can govern the shape of a literature review is important.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think you've got a great combination with this webinar. And once we've sent the recording round and your book, I think it provides a great sort of foundation for literature reviews to be conducted on whilst we're sort of seeing such a shift to AI.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Another question that we've got from the live chat. AI tools for literature review basically until now can only search among databases of open access papers. Is that correct? And if so, the results of these tools will be biased and will not include papers from closed databases such as Scopus, Web of Science. Do you have any suggestions in this respect and how to complement the work from AI tools with this?
Well, that's I'm not sure that's been my experience. Depends what you mean by open access. Open access where somebody has paid a publisher to give the full PDF of an article versus the closed one. It's not my experience that they only find open access papers. Perhaps they've only got access to the more complicated parts of a paper if it's open access. Yeah, I suppose what I'd be more concerned about is that, and I think this is a problem in reviews generally, is that you've only got access to published stuff, not just open access published stuff, but published stuff. What about all the grey literature? What about all the conference presentations? What about people's slides about how they make presentations and so on? I think AI is not going to be very good at dealing with that. And that's a problem with Google Scholar and with any of the databases, really. They're not going to be very good at that. And that's where your librarian is going to be, that's where your library is going to be your central resource. I mean, I haven't talked enough about the importance of the library for a literature review. We should remember that there's just so much, and I've got a whole section in the book on what the library can offer. So much in terms of finding, I don't know, videos, PowerPoints, advice to practitioners and so on in the grey literature, and sort of bang up to date stuff in grey literature as well, so, conference presentations and so on. So yeah, I would be worried about that, and I think that's where you can't just rely on AI. Not that you should just rely on AI, but particularly if you're doing a freestanding literature review of any complexity, it's so important, and particularly in the applied fields, to be able to get access to that grey literature and to be able to use the library.
Amazing. That's really great. Thank you. We've got time for a couple more questions before we close out. Just going back to one that we had received during the registration process. Which part of the literature review may be distorted or manipulated by the AI, and how do we prevent this from happening? I know we've sort of touched on that a little bit, but just to directly address the question.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's not so much manipulated and distorted unless you've got a sort of conspiratorial dimension to the problem. And not denying that there may be conspiratorial, looking at the people who are in charge of a lot of online stuff at the moment. Yeah, that is a problem. And I guess, the thing to do is to rely less on the artificial intelligence, more on human intelligence, less on machine intelligence, to look at the material that's available. There is so much that's available, and there is the possibility for that distortion. Although I have to say that, well, maybe my field isn't one which would be particularly open to any kind of deliberate distortion. But it's not something that I've noticed. I don't think there is any deliberate distortion. I think you're much more likely to be affected by accidental or other kinds of distortion, as we were talking about, getting hallucinated by particular keywords or particular words in the title of a key article that you might be interested in. So yeah, I think it's a kind of going back a stage, going back to the more assistive technologies rather than the generative technologies that would be the key there.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've probably got time for one more question before we close out, but we'll aim to follow up on as many of these as we can in a different format after the webinar. So just grabbing one more from the live chat. How do you see AI playing a role in assessing publication quality? Traditionally, we've relied on journal rankings, but with the rise of research in conference papers and other formats, could AI provide a more comprehensive evaluation?
Gosh, that's interesting. Well, I suppose, well, who knows what AI will be able to do in the future? If I'm just talking about it now, the short answer is no. One of the examples I give in the book, where I'm talking about criticality, is of the famous, or perhaps not so famous, case of Marshall and Warren, who identified the nasty little bacterium Helicobacter pylori that causes stomach ulcers. And to cut a long story short, their idea was taken to be so preposterous that no peer review paper would take their article for years and years and years, until one of them infected himself with Helicobacter pylori and got, hey presto, stomach ulcer. People started very, very gradually to take him seriously. I think the problem with AI is that it accentuates the problem in the peer review field of, I don't know, conservatism, just referring to what's already in the existing literature, being dubious, skeptical about new ideas. I think that's a really worrying thing about the whole peer review process. And the problem is that AI may accentuate that. So that's the last thing I'd want to see. Although, having been an editor of several journals over many years, I have to say that I'm not hugely impressed, and it's borne out by the research. Not hugely impressed by the way that reviewers review papers. But I don't think AI is going to add anything to that. I think what it's going to do is accentuate any problems that there already are if it's used to assess quality, or if there's a hope that it's going to assess quality in papers. I suppose it'll do things like identifying whether something's got it's got its introduction, it's got its methodology, it's got its findings, it's got its conclusions. I suppose it'll do things like that. But hey, who wants that? Who wants a tick box approach to assessing papers? Maybe the best paper in the world, Einstein's paper on relativity, is only a page long. It'll probably be refused by AI. The short answer is no. I wouldn't want that to happen. Not yet, anyway.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And yes, definitely human nuance is needed in many circumstances like this. I'll just hand over to Fawzia now to close out the webinar, but that was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, for answering all of those questions and for a very insightful, very educational webinar for us. Thank you, Amber, for hosting the questions. I know we didn't get around to answering all of them, but we will try to answer as many as we can offline. So keep your eyes open for a blog post coming up soon, and we'll send you the email link too, where we hope that Gary will answer as many of the questions I didn't get around to answering today on that forum. So as we said, that will be all we have time for. But if you've asked a question that we didn't get around to answering, as we said, we'll follow it up with it afterwards. Don't forget to visit our webpage, and you'll see here there's a QR code, and there is a discount code as well there for 25% off Gary's book, How to Do a Literature Review. And if you're actually a lecturer or a module leader, you can request an electronic copy from our webpage as well. And as we mentioned, we're going to be sharing the webinar recording link over the coming weeks. So if you want to, you can watch it again or share it with any of your colleagues who may be interested. Once again, thank you very much to Gary for his time today and this insightful presentation. And thank you, Amber, for the Q&A session and all the technical support. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.